Okay, so let's start. So today's class is all about trade protection. So when you're looking at trade protection, we're basically looking at what countries trying to restrict trade in the country. The free trade that results in exports to go to other countries and imports to come, we're trying to restrict it. And basically, we were just discussing in the previous classes about the gains of international trade and exploiting comparative advantage and efficiency. And suddenly, we're saying let's protect our trade, let's put trade protection, let's try to intervene in ways to basically try to protect our domestic producers. So suddenly we are moving away from a situation जहाँ पे हम पहले कह रहे थे कि international trade is good to a situation now we are trying to protect trade. So why do we need to protect trade? So this is the question that we're going to ask. And in this topic, not only will answer why do we need to protect trade, but also any counter arguments against protecting trade. Like अगर आप कह रहे हैं कि चीज trade को protect करना है, तो उसका 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 जो ultimately कोई नुकसान भी होता है. Is there any evaluation that we need to see? Is there any things that we need to see, be careful about, and so on? So one of the first argument that is raised uh, in favor of trade protection is the infant industry argument. And the argument says is that when you're looking at some industries are in their infancy. Infancy basically means they're just starting out, and therefore when they're just starting out, they need to be protected. And the reason why you want to protect them is because they have a potential comparative advantage. Potential comparative advantage का मतलब क्या होता है? Potential comparative advantage means that you don't have an advantage, you don't have an advantage, a comparative advantage right now, but you will probably going to have a comparative advantage later. And if you're going to have a comparative advantage later, this means that you can be protected today so that you can actually become a leading industry tomorrow. So a lot of developing countries like let's say Pakistan, Sri Lanka, India, all of these countries have these industries that are right now, as compared to foreign competition, they're too small. So if you look at them, they're too small right now. And once they can gain economies of scale, what is economies of scale? Economies of scale is basically what we call lower average cost. So once they gain economies of scale, they will become able to survive international competition. They will become better to compete with foreign firms. And with time, what will happen will be that these firms will be able to expand. They will be able to workers will become more experienced, and the industry will become more efficient. And that means basically in the initial days you need to protect them so that they can exploit their potential comparative advantage. And then once they have achieved that comparative advantage, you can basically remove the protection. So the argument is pehle kuch saalon, first few years you need to protect them, and later on you can remove that protection. Does that make sense? Are we happy with the infant industry argument, which is basically arguing that protect the industries in their infancy, and later when they become better, remove that protection? And initially, why do you want to protect them? Because you can't compete with the Chinese, you can't compete with those established players, let's say the Germans and so on. So initial days you need to protect them. Are we good to move on? Any questions from anyone? Okay. So am I good to move on? So let's say what's the counter argument to this? The counter argument to this basically infant industry argument is this, that first of all the government needs to identify those industries which are truly winners. Let's say if you are finding an industry that is a winner, then that's good. But what if the industry is not a winner but a loser? For example, what if Pakistan decides to protect its car industry? Now, Pakistan car industry is basically too many years behind the German and the Japanese and so on. And if you are protecting that car industry, ultimately, you know this, that even in the long term, they will never become efficient, which means you're wasting your resources because there was to start off no potential comparative advantage. So the first thing government needs to do is to make sure they try to protect only those industries which have a true potential comparative advantage, and no, not those industries which will not turn out to be winners in the future. Does that make sense, guys? Say yes or no. If you are saying yes, then I'm good to move on, which means there's no question. Okay, awesome. Awesome, awesome. So once we move on, so that's one thing. So you need to have winners rather than losers. That's one thing. Haris is saying no. Why, Haris? What's the question? What part did you not get? Let me repeat it again if, for you. Do you want me to repeat it, Haris? So Haris, I'm saying this कि अगर आपकी नई industry होती है, if you have a new industry, you are trying to protect it. But what if this new industry is not so good enough for protection? What if in the future it doesn't turn out to be a true winner? In the sense that it doesn't turn out to be one that can easily stand on its own feet and be able to compete with the foreign giants. If you're not going to, if that industry is not truly going to compete even in the future, why waste money today? Why 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 protect an inefficient industries to begin with? So that's the argument that we say. Make sense? The second argument that we have basically is that industries sometimes that are protected by trade barriers sometimes, so this is a counter argument for your infinite industry argument, and we say that industries which are protected by trade barriers lack the competitive pressure to become efficient. So basically what we say is this, that what if industries become too complacent? Like if let's say, if you are protecting me from foreign competition, and I know that this protection is going to last many years, I may never become efficient to start off with. So a lot of times what happens is this, that industries become too complacent, and because they lack the competitive pressure to become efficient. And if that's the case, then what you will have is a problem where protection can only be the reason for them to survive. As soon as you remove that protection, let's say 5 6 years later you remove that protection, you will see that they will not be able to compete well later on. So the argument is that, so two counter arguments for infant industry. Number one, you should choose the right industries, winners and not losers. And number two, you should make sure that the industries are not complacent, that tomorrow they should be able to compete with the future. So please give an example of when such protection will be applicable. A good example of when such protection is applicable is like in the US, they protect their car industry a lot, and the reason why they do that is because the Japanese and the German are basically producing better cars at a better price. So what US does is put a tariff, a tax, like a tariff on the German and the Japanese, so that their car industry stays protected. Infant industry argument could be like Pakistan, for example. For example, can say that, what, let's protect our plastic industry. Let's say if we are competing with the Chinese, and the Chinese are too big a player, so you can protect uh, your plastic industry by initially giving them a protection, and hopefully once they become better you can remove that protection. Does that make sense, guys? Are we good to move on? So one of the first arguments we raise is the infant industry argument, which simply says that protect the industry protect the industry in the initial days so that it becomes better and gain economies of scale for the future. But uske liye zaruri kya hai? What is important is basically, number one, they should not become complacent. Number two, they should have true competitive advantage. Okay, moving on to the next point. Is there any question before I move on to the next point? Okay, so let's move on to the next point. The next point that I'm going to talk about is something called sunset industry or job protection. The sunset industry or job protection argument says this, that sometimes you want to protect industries which are what we call declining. Declining industries or sunset industries are those which have basically lost their comparative advantage. Like a good example of this is US industry for cars. US has lost this comparative. Like 60s and 70s, US cars were ranked equal to the Japanese and the other cars, 70s, 80s, in fact. But now US cars are not ranked equally. In fact, they are not superior to the Japanese and the German car. And that is a very important reason of why there is a lot of jobs that are lost in the car industry. Like Michigan is a state which is the car industry, and in Michigan, there's a huge unemployment building up because of the decline of the car sector in the US. So US trying to protect their jobs, may want to sort of put trade protection on the German and the Japanese producer. And why do you want to protect jobs? Because you know this, that there's a large human cost of sudden industrial closure, such as, for example, अगर आपकी jobs चली जाएंगी, if the jobs are lost, people will lose income, people will lose skills, people will lose motivation. So in order to protect these income, skills, and motivation, you may want to sort of protect this industry, probably in the short run only. Probably only in the short run, but not in the long run, because you can't really sustain to protect the declining industry in the long run. All you want to do is basically make sure that there's a smooth transition that may happen, for example, 7 to 8 years or 10 years. And once the declining, or maybe you want the declining industries to become better, so you want to protect it. Maybe that could be a reason as well. But the idea goes this: you're trying to protect jobs, and that's why you're protecting the industry. Make sense? Are we good with this argument? I'll discuss the counter argument to this in 1 minute. Are we good? Is everyone sorted? Are we good to move on? Okay, great. What's the counter argument to the loss of or the sunset industry? Well, one of the arguments people raise is that at one point you are trying to benefit the manufacturer. You are benefiting the manufacturer. You're also benefiting the workers, because workers will have their jobs protected and manufacturers will have their revenue protected. But at the same time, who's paying the price of it? And the answer is consumer. Your domestic consumer actually suffers. Why does he suffers? He suffers because of the fact that you are trying to protect your producers and manufacturers and workers by giving domestic producer higher price. So for example, if there's a Toyota Corolla that comes to your country for $20,000, you put another tax of $5,000 or tariff of $5,000 to make the price to become $25,000. So this is the tariff or tax that you put, which makes the price to go up to $25,000. So who is paying this high price? And the answer is the domestic consumer ends up paying 5,000 more just because you want to protect the jobs. So the domestic consumer is the party that suffers, which means एक तरफ you are benefiting the producers, but only at the expense of domestic consumers. Domestic consumer end up buying foreign cars at an expensive price, or even they are forced to buy domestic cars which are of low quality. Make sense? Another counter argument that we have is that what if other countries retaliate? For example, you put a tariff on the Japanese cars, and the Japanese decide to put a tariff on your iPhones or on your applications or on your softwares. So then Silicon Valley or your Los Angeles may, you will see the California may, you'll see the jobs to go down, because at one point you are protecting your car industry, but at the same, which is in Michigan, you are also losing jobs in California because the other country has put a tariff on you. So what we say is that if other countries retaliate by imposing trade restrictions on exports, you will lose jobs in another sector of the economy. So you are not able to protect jobs because somebody is going to put a trade barrier or a tariff on you and put a counter what you call counter retaliation will happen. Does that make sense, guys? So one of the arguments that we raised, therefore, is that maybe job protection argument may not make sense because other countries may actually put a trade barrier on you on another sector. Does that make sense? Are we good? Is there any question? Any question, guys? The That's a good question, Yaya. The domestic consumers, of course, domestic consumers are paying higher price for foreign cars, but domestic consumers basically, if the demand is inelastic, yes, of course, they may need to pay a higher price in general. But you're right, there could be a fall of demand as well, which could mean loss of jobs. I agree. There could be a possibility of that as well. Also, guys, it's very important to ask me questions, ask questions to everyone so everyone can see your question. So some people are writing, giving me, asking me questions on a privately, but it's great to ask questions to everyone so that everyone can read your questions, so that they can answer, or I can answer and they can listen to the answer and read the question as well. Okay. Am I going to move on to the next point? So let's look at the next point. Another key reason why we need to protect trade, and this is where the most important argument is because of dumping. What is dumping? Dumping is basically selling below cost of production. In other words, selling something at a loss. Why do you want to sell something at a loss is something which we need to understand. Sometimes country are doing what we call dumping, which is basically selling it at a loss for two important reasons. The two important reasons is basically to do with, number one, sometimes the country may have overproduced a good, and if you have overproduced a good, you might not have a market for them, and because you don't have a market for them, you're willing to dump it into another country to get rid of the surplus. So for example, as the Chinese made a lot of cigarette lighters, and now they don't have a market to sell them. So now what they're doing is this, that they are actually trying to sell it in another market at a loss, and that is a big problem now. Why? Because if they're selling it at a loss, then they are basically destroying the local market. But the reason why they're selling it at a loss is because they have now overproduced it, and they are not finding a market for them. Does that make sense? So one reason why you sell at a loss is because you have overproduced it and you want to get rid of the surplus. The second reason why you want to sort of basically uh, you want to basically sort of sell at a loss is because you want to do what we call predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is basically when you're selling it at a lower price purposely only to destroy the existing competition in the overseas market. A lot of time Chinese are blamed for this kind of predatory pricing, where they said that, you know what Chinese do, they will probably go to the market, they will sell it at a loss, and once they sell it at a loss, they will increase the price later in the future when the market basically is completely destroyed. So you come in the market, you sell at a loss, domestic producers will shut down businesses, and as soon as they shut down business, you increase the price later. So by penetrating the foreign market, you sell it at a loss only to increase the price later. Now this doesn't have any counter argument. If somebody is dumping because he wants to get rid of the surplus, or somebody is dumping because they want to do predatory pricing, then there is all the more reason for us to protect our trade, because they are trying to destroy our markets in a manner which is kind of illegal. Does that make sense? So dumping is the third reason why trade protection happens, and it's a pretty valid reason why trade protection should happen. Are we good? Any questions? If there are no questions, then I can move on to the next point. Okay, let me move on to the next point then. The next point, can you explain again the second one? I can do that, Haris, later. I want to move on to the next one. Are you happy with the third point? We will move on to the second point in the end of the at the end of class. So are we happy? Okay, great. Let's look at the last reason why sometimes countries may want to protect trade, and we say some countries may sometimes want to protect trade because of the balance of payment. You know, your X minus M. Because if your X minus M goes up, we know AD goes up, and if AD goes up, we know GDP goes up. Okay, so you want to protect X minus M, or for example net exports as we call them. And net exports, by the way, is part of your balance of payment. The more net exports you will have, the more foreign currency you will have, the more jobs you will have, the more GDP you will have, and you want to sort of protect you want to protect basically your international trade through that. Does that make sense? So one of the reasons why you want to sort of protect your trade is because you want to protect your country's balance of payment, and you don't want to have a current account in a deficit. It's a whole discussion that I will have in a later in few days later, where we will talk about current account deficit in detail. But right now, I want to talk about is that when the X minus M goes up, AD goes up, and therefore GDP goes up. So you want to make the GDP goes up and employment go up. Let me write this. Also, employment goes up. So that's why you want to sort of protect trade by putting trade restrictions like tariffs and quotas and so on. But why is that a bad idea? What are the counter arguments for it? And one of the counter argument for this is that such a technique of protecting trade only works in the short run. It's a short run fix कि आपने किसी चीज को महंगा कर दिया, you made something expensive. It can only work in the short run. In the long run, you need to really find out the reason why people are not buying your goods, because you don't have a competitive advantage, or basically there's a lack of demand for your goods, or basically you are not competitive. And if you're not competitive, and if you're trying to make yourself look relatively cheaper by making the foreign goods expensive, it can only work in the short run. It may not work in the long run. In the long run, you will lose out. Second important thing you need to understand is that while this is only a short run ploy, what if some other country retaliate? If other country retaliate, as we said earlier, if the other country retaliate, then while you are able to protect one of your industries, somebody may put a tariff on your other industries, and ultimately your exports may not go up, may go down, or may remain unchanged. So what we say is that balance of payment argument may not work well. Number one, because you are only trying to protect an industry. It can work in the short run, but long run, may you need to find a reason why this happened to you. Why are you losing your competitive advantage? Maybe you need to lower your cost. Maybe you need to become better. And secondly, what you need to do is that you need to, if other countries retaliate, then you will not be able to see X minus M to go up. Because if you put a tariff on Japanese will put a tariff on you, and ultimately your exports will not go up. You reduce their exports, they reduce your exports. Does that make sense, guys? Do we understand the balance of payment argument? Is there any questions about this? If there's no question, then we are sorted and we can move on. Can I explain the argument again? Yes, the argument basically says is that a country may want to sort of may want to make their X minus M to go up, net exports to go up. And for net exports to go up, the reason why they want to make the net exports go up is because they want to make the AD go up. Remember, AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So when the X minus M goes up, AD goes up. And when AD goes up, of course, GDP goes up and employment goes up. And so you want to sort of protect your X minus M, you want to protect your AD to not decline. And that's why you want to sometimes put trade barriers and quotas. The argument against it, the argument against it is the one that they could be number one, it is only a short run fix. It's not a long run fix. In the long run, you will see you don't have the competitiveness and you will not be, people won't buy your goods. Number two, it's that what if somebody retaliate? If somebody retaliate, then again, you will not have that advantage to start off with. So these are two arguments which are against it. Are we good with this? Does that make sense, guys? Okay. Now I want to go back to what Haris was asking. Haris was saying, what is the argument for sunset industry? So our Haris sunset industry argument is simply that, you know what, if a country is trying to protect trade or jobs, the number one problem that can happen is this, that you are making consumers suffer. Consumers are basically paying a higher price because you're putting a tariff. So domestic consumers end up paying a higher price because you want to protect the jobs of domestic workers. Okay. And the second argument we say is basically to do with that the foreign countries could retaliate, and if foreign countries retaliate, then some other sector of your country may suffer. So you put a tariff on the car industry, they will put a tariff on your cell phone industry. Ultimately, some other sector will lose its job. So that's why this may not be viable. So whenever you're writing an answer, guys, so just to wrap it up now, whenever you're writing an argument, you're writing an answer for trade protection, I'm going to send you some essay questions on that. Whenever you're writing an essay question answer on trade protection, you need to give these arguments, and you need to also, while you're giving these arguments, give the evaluation while you're talking about it. So that's how it's presented. So, for example, if you're giving an infinite industry argument, you can then talk about the reasons why infinite industry argument may not work well. And similarly, if you're giving an argument for example, sunset industry, give the evaluation while you're giving that point as well. So you don't need to give an evaluation at the end. You can give it while you are explaining your answer. Okay, does that make sense? Are we good? Any questions, guys? I think if there are no questions, then I am basically um, I'm sorted. We are done for the lecture today, and we will meet tomorrow. Um, so so that's it for today, guys. We discussed sunset. We said discuss the arguments. Tomorrow is a very important class because we will talk about tariffs and quotas. We will discuss tariffs and quotas. I'm going to explain this. So tomorrow's class is very important. Okay. So thank you very much. Keep on revising. Keep on working hard, and I will send you the macro notes on drives as well. In fact, um, this is the folder. This is the folder that already has the macro notes apparently. So I was told this is where every you guys can get your notes as well. Okay. See you guys tomorrow, same time, 9 a.m. Okay. Bye bye.